Hi, everybody. I'm Tom Carruthers. I'm Director of the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It's great to have all of you with us today. We're looking forward to a great discussion of civil society and the pandemic. At the Carnegie Endowment, the last several years, we've been studying the state of civic activism in the world, and we've been focused on what's really a tremendous dynamic of conflicting imperatives. On the one hand, you've had a huge trend of closing space for civil society around the world, governments restricting the space for civil society, trying to limit its role and function. Yet at the same time, civic activism has been tremendously dynamic in many ways in the last several years, despite these restrictions. We see a new generation of civic actors, often very tech savvy, campaign oriented, fluid, dynamic, thoughtful, engaging in different ways despite this difficult environment. And we've seen a tremendous range of protest movements around the world that reflect this dynamism. So a tremendous dualism, which has characterized the situation of civil society. Into that context comes the pandemic. And the pandemic has, in my view, heightened, intensified this dualism. On the one hand, the pandemic has caused governments to institute a tremendous range of lockdowns involving all kinds of restrictions on civil society, freedom of movement, freedom of association, and often freedom of speech. So this has been the most restrictive period in living memory in many ways for civic activism. Yet at the same time, the pandemic creates a tremendous need for citizens to engage, to be active, to respond, to find ways to fight this virus and to improve government responses to it. So this conflicting imperative that we saw in the last several years is only intensified in this new period. That's what we're going to explore today. What are some of the ways in which these conflicting imperatives are playing out in different parts of the world? As we've done our research in recent years, we've drawn upon the work of Carnegie's Civic Research Network, a terrific group of researchers around the world who are specialists in civic activism. And we have three of them with us today. We may be joined by a fourth. Maureen Kade-Maunga in Zimbabwe has been having trouble connecting this morning or this afternoon, but we hope she may be able to join us. But we have with us Youssef Sharif from Tunisia, who's the Deputy Director of Columbia University's Global Center in Tunis. We have Janjira Sombat Pumsiri, who's with the university in Thailand, as well as with the Institute for Global and Area Studies, in Germany. And we have Vijayan MJ, a well-known civic activist and researcher in India engaged in a lot of peace and justice issues. And it looks like we may have Maureen Kade-Maunga with us. Maureen, glad you can join us. Maureen is both a scholar associated with the University of Pretoria, but also a very active activist in women's political empowerment issues in Zimbabwe. So she'll be joining the conversation as well. So what I'm going to do, I have a list of questions for our group. We're going to start just question by question, no long presentations, not a set panel. It's going to be a discussion. I'm going to move the discussion along through the questions for a while, but then I'm hoping you'll contribute with some questions. I think you have different ways you can send them to us. I'm going to see them in my chat function. My team is bringing them in by tweet and chat and other ways. So we'll try to bring your questions and comments into the discussion as well. But let me go ahead and start with the first question. It's really a kind of a framing question for our discussion, which is what new roles is the pandemic creating for civic activism, for civil society in countries around the world? How is it changing what they do in this situation? I'm going to start with Youssef on this question. Youssef?
In a place like Tunisia, where first of all there is a vibrant civil society and where we can follow and monitor the work of civil society, the many organizations, many CSOs shifted their work from working, for instance, on democracy promotion, on fighting governance, on youth stuff. They shifted their work to a kind of fully committed to fighting COVID-19. So we've seen these mostly young people, actually going to hospitals and distributing masks or cleaning public spaces, etc. In a way, they've been completing or continuing the work of government in places where the government proved either inefficient or too weak to act. They were actually very efficient, and they proved that they can be of a big help to both to the authorities and to the general public. In some places, of course, that was fully accepted by the authorities, especially the local authorities. In other places, less so. So in the case of Tunisia, for instance, the head of one of the most important NGOs in the country spent the night under custody in the beginning of the lockdown because he broke the lockdown to distribute masks to hospitals. So we've seen both sides, both the authorities accepting or willing to work with these groups, or refusing them and or making their life difficult. But so far, and I mean the results of 2 months, the groups, most of the civil society groups in Tunisia, at least, proved able to adapt and to become fully, fully engaged in the fight against COVID-19.
Thank you. Thanks, Yusuf. Let's turn to Zimbabwe. Maureen, great that you could join us. What do you think, what new roles have civic actors, civic activists been playing in Zimbabwe since the virus has hit?
Well, the case of Zimbabwe is a bit different. I think with the coming of COVID-19 and wanting to deal with it, the government has actually found an opportunity to close space more. So organizations that have always worked in democracy and governance at the initial stages started to work in communities to try and help. I have an example of the Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights.
We may be losing Maureen.
We've been trying to
there we are.
Work with the people.
Maureen, I think you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's better. Go ahead, please. Go ahead. Now we hear you fine.
Have been distributing food in the communities, but the problem is that there's been more, in fact, of their need in their usual spaces where
defending people's voices, their freedoms of association, and at least those rights that cannot be abrogated no matter what, because the soldiers are like in the streets, they've been deployed, and a lot of human rights abuses have been happening. So we've seen an increase in their usual work, but also they're in the communities, assisting with food packs, assisting with essential services, trying to complement the government, which has not been able to provide essential services to people during the lockdown.
Okay, let's turn to, thank you. Let's turn to Vijayan and a perspective from India.
Yeah, thank you, Tom and Khan, for this opportunity, but also for that very fantastic compilation of the civil society in coronavirus. India stands now at 100,000 plus infections. It's fast growing. 13.6 seems to be the latest calculation of days that it is taking India to double the number of patients. More than 3,000 people have died. At the very outset, I think I want to thank the health workers and sanitation workers across the globe in India who have risked their everything in taking care of the people. There's been a complete abandoning of the people by the government. This has been the real situation post the lockdown declaration. And actually it is, if not for the ordinary people who stepped out to help, we would have become a mass graveyard by now. Not just because of the coronavirus infection, but because of the lockdown and the economic starvation it caused. The PM had almost 2 months to prepare the country and administration for the pandemic, but instead gave the people a 4-hour notice, and it's nearly 2 months since then. So the pictures of mass exodus, and a lot of people have been talking internationally about the migration of people from urban centers to back to their rural areas. But even in the face of that, what the government did was crackdowns. Now, how did the civil society respond? Because you had a situation where more than 250 million Indians got stranded in city centers alone. And surveys said that in migrant workers, almost 96% of them, internal migrants, did not receive any government rations or food supplies or their payments during the lockdown period. People responded, and I think this is the crux of the point, that people responded despite the lockdown, despite police crackdowns, and witch hunts, arrests in many cases, like Yusuf said, on civil society activists for pre-COVID anti-government protests as well as lockdown violations. people organized themselves in many thousand small clusters locally and responded to the crisis. It is indeed very heartening that the human race is, when the human race is faced with an existential crisis, one could see humanism re-emerging. And I think the progressive civil society in India got its act together much before the government did. Many of the people who were in resistance before came out very actively, and they completely repurposed themselves, repositioned themselves to fighting the COVID crisis, be it on medical emergencies like providing the PPEs to the hospital or providing food to the people. I think the survey proved that actually almost 67% of the country's main states, it was the civil society that was providing food and relief support. So it was a multiplicity of engagement. Yeah.
Good. Thanks for the really thoughtful overview of the whole situation. Let's turn to Janjira, who's going to give us both a perspective in Thailand, but she's mentioned she'd also like to, if when she can, bring in some wider perspectives from Southeast Asia. Janjira, please.
Right. Thank you, Tom. So, I mean, in Southeast Asia, one has to be reminded that the state capacities in the region are quite low, with the exception of Vietnam and Singapore. So, accordingly, civil society's activism during COVID tend to fill the gaps left by these states. So, there are probably three distinctive forms of activism in the region. One is that the continuation of existing humanitarian groups in the same area of work. So these humanitarian groups have been distributing food and masks and other medical supplies to vulnerable communities, as in Tunisia and India. The second group, which is quite interesting, these are nationally political groups or advocacy groups that had been protesting against the governments before the lockdown. So under the lockdown, they kind of reoriented their political campaigns to more charity work, mutual aid program. But this charity work somehow serves as a platform for consolidating movements network and their grassroots legitimacy. And lastly, we have seen an increase in numbers of non-political groups, such as doctors and nurses, who have been protesting and demanding health emergency measures from the state. So, for example, in Indonesia, doctors have threatened to strike if the government still hasn't provided enough medical supplies. In Thailand, doctors have been protesting for the same reason. So I think these are three very distinctive forms of activism in Southeast Asia.
Okay, thanks for the overviews. I want to go now into some of the specific points that you raised and see if we can probe some details here. One of the things that's on my mind, I've been wondering is, you know, all of us have been adjusting our lives in the last couple of months to living under lockdown and changing how we do things as well as what we do. And I'm wondering, for civic activists that you observe in the places where you live and work, civic activists are often quite tech savvy to start with, but have they been adjusting to this new context by finding new ways to operate that you think may last beyond the pandemic? In a sense, are we in a phase of intensive learning and transformation of activism that may have, in a sense, a longer tail beyond the crisis? Yusuf, what do you think about that question with respect to Tunisia?
I think because of what you mentioned, I mean, they are tech savvy and they've been already quite advanced on, I mean, in the case of the Arab world in general, it's Facebook mostly. So they've been having all these groups on Facebook, all these, you know, so the online activity is not something new. What is new is actually, it's becoming something more regular. So, for instance, the concept of webinars, which was not that you know, that common here in the Middle East and North Africa. It existed, but it was not something that people would spend hours watching. So now there are more and more webinars on all kinds of things, and it's starting new discussions online. Now some of these groups are moving to even teaching via webinars, which is also, I mean, of course, in Europe or in the US, online education is something very common. Now maybe civil society groups by having these webinars and by teaching all kinds of classes on maybe music or dancing or etc. They are starting something new. Also, the fact that they are using now more and more internet, and again mainly Facebook, to create videos to raise awareness about how to wear masks and wash hands. But these are things that are very specific to COVID-19. But one very important thing that has started with COVID-19, which is about fighting fake news related to COVID-19, and that actually in the future may be very useful to have people in places that are actually corrupted by fake news and by all kind of propaganda. Have people used to these tools that check and destroy and debunk fake news. This is, I think, something very important that has started with COVID-19.
Thanks. I'm going to turn to the others on this question. We have an interesting question from a viewer, Monty McBurchie, who asked about how civic activists are responding to increased surveillance. Basically, of course, increased surveillance has become a feature in many countries of the response to the pandemic. Let's stick on the question of methods for now. We'll come to the question on surveillance. So, Maureen, what kind of, do you see civic activists taking advantage of the current situation, or in a sense, adapting to it productively in ways that change how they operate that may continue over time?
I think in the case of Zimbabwe, online activism is not something that's very common. A lot of people actually have to meet physically. So virtual spaces are very limited. But with the lockdown and COVID-19, we've seen that a lot of virtual spaces are starting to come up, especially for the urban civil society spaces. They're starting to have virtual spaces where people are interacting. But the downside of it is that the rural areas where they don't have, enough internet coverage are then left out. So they are not included, and that is a big problem because Zimbabwe is about 60% rural, and a lot of people who were participating in civil society work before are not participating, even when civil society has repurposed, and many are trying to assist the vulnerable with food packs and other things. People in the rural areas, it's very difficult to gather enough information of who needs what and where they are because of having to do everything online. It's not a very common culture, and it's also not structurally supported. We don't have enough infrastructure for that. I think also the positive side to this online activism and creation of new civic spaces online is that a lot of people are able to meet now and exchange views without the threats to personal safety and security. Because here, there's a lot of surveillance and there's a lot of violation from the police. If you want police brutality, when they meet people who are meeting, who are discussing, things that they think are critical of the government. A lot of times people are dispersed by tear gas, they're beaten up. In January last year, we had about 7 people who were gunned down by the soldiers. And in August of the previous year, 2018, we had about the same number of people also being gunned down on the streets while protesting. So it's very dangerous to just gather and discuss freely. So online activism and this civic spaces have created some form of safety and sense of safety for some people to start to speak out.
Now, let me turn to Vijay on this, but I would comment that when you're talking about, the rural-urban divide being accentuated by the reliance on technology, it's been such a theme of civil society development over the last 20 years, the tendency both of the international community and often national communities to favor civil society development in urban centers, and you get an urban-rural split and a differential sort of impact and such. And in many ways, the pandemic is creating or sort of fostering new inequalities or heightening existing inequalities in society. And we'd hate to see that same pattern reproduce itself with respect to civic activism and civil society. So it's something definitely that I think the funding community is going to be thinking carefully about how they can counteract that trend. Vijay, what about the situation in India with respect to methods, techniques?
Tom, I think primarily the isolation and social distancing of people definitely took away the collective responses. as well as the courage to dissent. And I think that loss of the unity, sense of unity in taking out protests, etc. Because especially February 2020 was a time when there was raging protests across India. I mean, women's groups, Muslim groups.
It was huge. I mean, the against the
massive,
Citizenship
massive.
Act, yeah. It was enormous.
And the government used the pandemic also as an effective time to force shut down many of the ongoing resistance, criminalize the Muslim community, etc. But now, if you look at it, a lot of those communes have rebuilt themselves today. And they've used technology platforms like Zoom or others. There are several efforts by the civil society groups, organized as well as informal groups, to regroup. From cultural efforts to reimagining the economy, there are many such efforts, because the anti-CAA groups, they have now formed an online cultural gathering with music and poetry against the witch hunt of activists. But however, I think one must not understate the fact that there is cynicism about activism now getting restricted to online platforms only, especially that of organized CSOs. And that's a concern, as you correctly said, this rural-urban divide. I mean, many of our community activists are not accessible for a Zoom chat or a Zoom webinar. And many a times then it gets restricted to English-speaking or urban activists in a certain sense. And that's a growing concern. We are ourselves trying to fight it. Many of the organizations and groups are making efforts to counter that. So hence, while the positives include opportunities at regrouping, time under lockdown to engage with reimagining political economy kind of efforts, the negatives involve separation of a class of activists and civic workers from the people in the ground. And this is something that the civil society will have to very seriously address. And the negatives also include enhanced monitoring and surveillance by state agencies on online platforms.
Good. Yeah. Okay. Janjir, what are your thoughts on this question?
Well, I mean, I actually agree with Vijay and Maureen that online activism is not accessible for a lot of remote places. But also, I think in Southeast Asia, for example, prior to the lockdown, there were already protests in Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia against shrinking space, basically. And what happened is that these protests are now on pause. So activists have to shift to online spaces for organizing and for staging protests. And for me, online spaces are very useful for countering official narratives. Twitter, for example, is very, very popular platform in Thailand, and the young people always take to Twitter to criticize the government. But when it comes to organizing, I would argue that online spaces don't have that capacity of disrupting, of projecting power. And I think that when it comes to protests, you need that, leverage.
We have an interesting question that came in from Hannah Hanses, which asks that if democracy groups that have traditionally focused on key democratic issues are shifting gears in the pandemic context to focus more on socioeconomic responses. You could see this either way. In a sense, you could argue maybe that's going to be positive because some of these groups will connect more with local constituencies, build a greater sense of local connection. Or you could see, well, that has some negative implications. These groups are going to lose the focus on those issues. They'll be, in a sense, distracted by these more immediate concerns right at a time when governments are increasing their reach, consolidating power in some ways that could be questionable. It's a really difficult balance. I know, Yusuf, you've talked, for example, about groups in Tunisia we've been using the term repurposing. Maureen used that term as well, repurposing, which is clearly a positive adaptation. What do you think the implications are in terms of the balance of democratic engagement in groups versus the shift towards the socioeconomic?
So first of all, among the organizations that repurposed their work, they're still also doing, for instance, one of them that specializes in fighting corruption is now monitoring the spending of the government on COVID-19, on the COVID-19 fight. So they created a platform to monitor where the money is going and how it is being used and spent. So it's not that they are shifting completely their work. So that's one thing. The other thing, what you mentioned, is true. I mean, on the long term, if all they do is social work, of course, they will lose their main task. Now the problem is, because of the urgency of the situation, if they had they done the other way around, had they started saying that no, the government should not lock down, the government should not surveil, etc., they would be a little bit like those who, in the heart of the fight against terrorism, are putting themselves in the side of terrorists in a way. So in a way they saved their legitimacy by doing this. However, I think this is more of a punctual situation that that allows them now to consolidate their legitimacy and to go back to their initial work in a few months from now.
I want to actually have Vijay on thoughts on this. Then, Maureen, I want to come to you. Vijay, what do you think? India has such a complex intermix of socioeconomic justice issues with the concerns over India's democratic trajectory in the last couple of years. How do you think this pandemic is going to affect that balance in terms of civic activism?
Well, I mean, in principle, there are two contrasting aspects in my response that I want to bring forth. And that's, one is this government that's trying to use an absolute, what I would often call as the COVID authoritarianism, because we have a megalomaniac approach to this whole thing. I mean, look at the ritualistic responses that you saw in terms of people being asked to come to the balconies and clap for health workers at a time when health workers had to be provided with PPEs. So I think there is that contradiction that you see when it comes to this. But at the same time, I think the civic actors, they have tried to address the political questions continuously, and I think that's to the credit of Indian civil society, that we have not let go of the fundamental political challenges and rights-based challenges that had to be raised with this government. If you look at it now, like, why is it that the Modi government has gone in for a complete abolition of labor laws, a complete abolition of environmental norms? Then you see that, okay, this community is constantly haunting this government on the questions of on workers' rights, on the questions of projects being given a complete go-ahead using the pandemic time. So I think that fundamentality of keeping up with the health crisis on the one hand, on the other side, actually making sure that the basic questions are not allowed to just let go. Because on the urban question, I mean, if you look at the number of groups that have actually come together to not just make statements online, but also to have their different small units work in different working class areas and unite the working class community in terms of providing them food, shelter, rations, etc. But there is also a constant political activity that is happening as part of that, I would imagine. And I think it's a very, very challenging situation, and I don't think everybody has been able to do what they should have. But at the same time, I think the fact that they have managed to continue with the political battle is to the credit of the Indian civil society.
Maureen, any thoughts on this? I mean, this is a particularly important question in Zimbabwe, given the very limited political space, the real difficulties of frustrated democratic development, particularly after the change in leadership several years ago. Do you feel that there's a shifting away from a focus on key democratic issues because civil societies, in a sense, has no choice but to engage at the socioeconomic realities of the pandemic?
So I think for Zimbabwe, like you rightly say, in 2017 November, we witnessed a coup, and now our regime is highly militarized. Their responses to things are almost militaristic. So the problem or the challenge that I've seen in the past few weeks is that, especially for women's groups, most of the women's civil society has been in the communities helping people with food, with PPEs and other things. But 2 weeks ago, we had an incident where the police or police officers who were patrolling an area came across two women who were going to shop, and they were basically out for essentials, and they beat these women up and brutalized them. But we had very little from the women's organizations, and it is perhaps because they are working in communities trying to provide social services, and this means that they have to cooperate with the government to a certain extent. So I think we are starting to see people becoming compromised, or groups becoming compromised to an extent where they are not able to speak out against the government because they want to continue doing the work where they are, providing needed social services to people in need. I think, again, just last week on Wednesday, another group of 3 young women were arrested at a roadblock, and then they disappeared for 30 hours, only later to be found dumped on the roadside, brutalized, and sexually assaulted. These are very prominent activists. One of them is a member of parliament, young, she's 26, and 2 other youth leaders in the opposition here. And what we saw again is that other groups like the Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights, we've already been doing both COVID work and also their traditional work of defending human rights, have been on the forefront, for trying to get justice for these young women. But we see that women's organizations, most of them have either issued lukewarm statements or have decided to stay out of the story because already they feel like they are cooperating with the government, trying to help the needy in communities, and they don't want to jeopardize that. So for me, what I see now is that we are reversing the gains or the incremental gains of civil society insofar as trying to fight for the opening up of space is concerned, and insofar as human rights and democracy issues are concerned. Because the moment people start to work in communities, they have to work through traditional chiefs, for example, in rural areas. And most of those are aligned to the ruling party. And you have to, toe the line. Otherwise, you will not be able to do that work. So it is really, really weakened civil society.
Janjira, this is a huge question for Thailand. I mean, Thailand has been, just in a very fraught political situation in recent years, elections last year, but just one thing after another with respect to democratic losses, but also some opening up and gains more recently, at least in certain ways. How do you think, and civic, life, civic political life in Thailand, there's a great fusion of civic and political action in Thailand, but how do you think the balance will be for the citizen engagement in Thailand with respect to the overarching question of Thailand's possible democratic future versus sort of the immediate concerns of the pandemic?
I think one thing for sure is that the democratic struggle in Thailand is inseparable from the struggle for economic justice. So this has been seen as the 2 sides of the same coin. So I would say that this is an opportunity for pro-democracy activists to kind of further the exposure of economic inequality in Thailand that COVID reveals to all of us. So there have been a lot of pro-democracy groups that have used the issue of the lack of equal access to the government's cashback for the poor. So basically, just to give you some background, the government in Thailand has been giving people, some millions of people cashback for this time of unemployment. So, but not many people have the same access. So activists have made use of this inefficiency of the government in providing equal access to this cashback to further their pro-democracy cause. The difficult part is to overcome the division in the country, because even the opinion about economic inequality in Thailand is very divided. So on the one hand, you have activists, pro-democracy, pro-justice activists who see that the struggle for economic equality is their cause, and this is the mission for the country. And then you have the other side of civil society who say, well, this is just a matter of poverty. This is not about inequality, it's about poverty, and poor people are poor because they don't work enough, they lazy, so on and so forth. So it comes down to a matter of worldview, I would say. So I think in order to further the cause of social and economic equality, we also have to overcome this division.
I mean, you're all in different ways touching on what's really a fundamental issue caused by the pandemic with respect to democracy. There's a deep debate it's been going on for probably more than 100 years about, do we view democracy as a political system and see economic systems as somehow separate from that, and the question of economic justice being different from the question of political, rights and liberties and so forth. And some people I know here in the United States are feeling like maybe this is a turning point. Maybe this is the turning point where we have a conception of democracy. We get away from the old left-right division where some people say, oh, socioeconomic justice, that's those people on the left who are trying to mix up that with democracy. People in the center and the center right and right don't want that. Instead, people say, wait a minute, if we have a conception of societal resilience in which societies have to be able to withstand shocks, they have to be able to protect people from these kinds of different threats. That's not a left-right issue. That has to be a conception of democratic effectiveness, which is more inclusive, more based on this conception of both societal and personal resilience. Can't we have a discussion about that? So I think in a deeper sense, the questions about civic activism and whether it's playing a pro-democracy role or playing a socioeconomic role are starting to blur, and we're seeing something emerge that's a question of whether or not this is a turning point in the way we think about what citizens want from democracies. That relates, I want to get at the question of legitimacy of civil society. We have a question from Catherine Hughes-Freitag who asks about, is this a moment when civic actors are building new constituencies and in a sense strengthening their rootedness? And it's tied to a larger question I wanted to ask you about. You know, in recent years, governments who don't like civil society very much have been attacking its legitimacy. You're inauthentic. You're a bunch of elites. You're serving your own interests. You're not really with the people. We, the government, are the spokespeople for the people. You're just the cosmopolitan elites. Is this a moment, because of the changed engagement of civic activism in socioeconomic life, because of this change in conception of democracy, is this potentially a moment of, you know, changing that narrative about legitimacy? Is there a possibility we'll come out of this and people say, well, wait a minute, actually, you can't say that they're a bunch of inauthentic elites. They're the people down the street who are providing the, you know, the food kits that we need to survive or that. So do you think this is potentially a pivotal moment about legitimacy? I wanted to, let's turn to Yusuf about that. And if others want to come in, I'll turn to you as well.
At least in the case of Tunisia, I think, yes, so far, civil society has been accused by people in government or some groups in society in general as being foreign funded, as being a bunch of spoiled kids that spend their time on internet and coffee breaks and all these things. And now many of them are actually in the streets, first of all, risking their lives and fighting COVID-19. But secondly, as I said, seconding the government and being helpful to the authorities and being actually there where the authorities couldn't make it there. So at least for these kind of groups that are proving that they can be needed, they are gaining a lot of legitimacy out of this. And even though authorities so far, as I said, they are putting a lot of bureaucratic troubles. They're making a lot of bureaucratic troubles to these groups, sometimes being quite aggressive against them. Also, the authorities in general in Tunisia, at least now in this case, they are not very proud of this cooperation, or they're not praising it. They don't want to recognize that they're weak and civil society is taking over in some areas. But at least they, I mean, in general, they tolerate their work and they understand that they're needed. So this is a moment where many civil society groups in Tunisia, at least the ones who were able to move beyond the, I mean, the internet bubble and the elitist sphere, to move beyond and go on the street. At least these ones, they are gaining a lot of legitimacy out of this. And they, I think, in the future, as long as the country remains a democracy, I think they consolidated their position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Vijay, I'm sure you have thoughts on this, but I want to also turn to, why don't you come in, then I'll turn to Maureen, because in Zimbabwe with, you know, just the heavy repression, I'm really curious how this issue plays out. Vijay, what do you think about this with respect to India?
Well, the legitimacy question has been there forever. I mean, it's not just about some younger generation, cool people trying to do different stuff. There is a history to that whole conflict here in the Indian context between the left and the right, as Tom correctly pointed out. And I recollect how in 2016, when we brought out that report on the growing, the conservative civil society. And I think it turns out to be quite a futuristic work, also because of the fact that the whole framework of legitimacy debate itself had gotten changed over into populism versus minority voices. So dissent was categorized as minority very easily. and
minority in an ethnic sense, minority in terms of supporting Muslim
in terms
rights,
of democratic.
Oh, I see.
Minority.
Just that you're a small minority, and we're the populous majority.
So that was exactly. So the populism versus the minority, and the fact that the re-election of a government justifies its actions, despite the fact that none of the key issues that they were, none of the key policies became their fundamental reason for the re-election, but actually a terrorist attack in Kashmir that kind of brought together the whole national jingoistic framework. So I think this whole question of legitimacy, where activists were called five-star activists, etc., did exist, but also it was a question of how do you get within the people and the community. And I think the organized CSO sector had a serious problem with this. And I think it is important as self-reflection that organized CSOs and groups have had to go through a lot of exercises of repurposing themselves in the past 6 years. Not just as looking as agencies that do advocacy work and campaign work with the government for policy changes, but actually bring about constant conversations and dialogue within communities, especially where communal polarization is very high. I actually want to quote a COVID example, because some of the Muslim groups that have been working in the Gujarat state, where they're highly polarized and dealt with as almost Pakistanis, they are referred to. Which is supposedly a derogatory term in the Indian context. But the Muslim groups actually were providing food unconcerned of which community they were serving. And I think that really brought in a lot of conversations. I mean, we had Hindu-Muslim women talking, Hindu-Muslim women talking to each other, but also the Hindu men talking about how they were fooled into a kind of blind nationalism and blind faith-based, religious-based nationalistic, ultra-nationalistic understanding. So I think there is a question of rebuilding legitimacy that is there for the larger civil society in India. But at the same time, I think smaller groups, especially the more informal groups, are finding very powerful ways of building back legitimacy amongst the people.
Okay. Maureen, what do you think about this question of legitimacy? I know it's fundamental in Zimbabwe, where the government just doesn't recognize the legitimacy in many ways of basic civic activism.
So the government here in Zimbabwe has always accused civil society of being foreign funded and running with foreign agendas. And I think this propaganda has worked in some sectors to a certain extent. So before I speak about the government's own view or perception of civil society being changed, I think there are people in communities who are starting to appreciate civil society groups whom they've always thought are like opposition appendages and who are just working with the opposition political parties. For instance, people who are being abused during, the lockdown are able to access, free legal services. They're able to speak to journalists through the Media Institute of Southern Africa and all other things. So at least the people are starting to see that these are really legitimate groups with legitimate issues. They've been prevented from, accessing them for a long time, and they've actually been believing for a long time that these people are just pushing opposition politics or opposition political party interests. But where the government is concerned, the government continues to not trust civil society. I think they are monitored even more than before. And those who've wanted to work in communities, unfortunately, have to partner with government. And I think, like what Vijayan was saying, here in Zimbabwe also, the community-based organizations are the ones who are probably getting more leverage from this because they're able to work in communities and they are monitored less than the national civil society organizations. So organized civil society really just has to stay out of it or be compromised somehow through working with government. So instead of space opening up, I think it's just really closing up, and it's not really helping much for civil society because of the heavy-handedness of government, even during a pandemic crisis.
Thanks, Maureen. Janjira, just one thought do you have a thought you'd like to add on the legitimacy question?
Well, I mean, in Thailand, the question of civil society legitimacy has a lot to do with polarization that we've experienced over the past years. So civil society in Thailand is fragmented. The charity groups are not very political, so they would not be put in the same category as political groups when, in the view of legitimacy. So if they help people, for example, it doesn't really affect the equation of legitimacy in the Thai politics anyway. The problem is the political groups, whatever they do is still being interpreted this box of polarization. For example, the opposition movements would distribute food and provide masks for vulnerable communities. They would be seen as doing so for political, benefits. So there is that frame still that is preventing civil society to come together and kind of increase their legitimacy.
Mm-hmm. Good. We have a little less than 15 minutes, just a little more than 10 minutes left. We have a raft of great questions online. We have an interesting question about business and how is the role of business changing in the pandemic? Are there new alliances between business and civic actors? We have an important question about racism and targeting of Asians and whether or not how civic actors are responding to that. We have a question about traditional media, not just the sort of the new technological sort of online activism. How can activists take more advantage of traditional media? We have an important question about how these changes are going to last in the future. So there's a lot on the table, but we have one question that Claire McAvoy has just asked, which I want to focus on, which is, we see in some states, now we have a variety of democratic situations in the countries represented right here, Zimbabwe on the more repressive end, Thailand also, on the other hand, Tunisia on the more democratic, India somewhat more democratic. But there's a lot of concern around the world about governments using the pandemic to put into place restrictive measures that go well beyond what's required for the public health, to use this as an opportunity to lock in restrictions either on censorship or surveillance or other things, taking away checks and balances. What are some of the ways you think in this situation where questioning the government can be seen as disloyal in the face of the pandemic? What are some of the ways that you think right now civic activisms can try to respond, even though they're hunkered down, they're facing the need to engage at the socioeconomic level? Are there things that you see in the domestic level, but also you're all experienced on the international stage as well? Could the international actors be doing more at this point to try to push governments not to undertake these measures, to limit their sort of political grabbing that's going on in some cases? So Bijan, I suspect this is on your mind in India because the government has already been encroaching in different ways on in a sort of majoritarian fashion. What are some of the ways do you think government can limit this tendency of a government, civic actors can limit the tendency of the government to do that at this moment? I'll turn to you and then maybe to Maureen.
Well, I think primarily it is I want to quote something like 3 weeks into the lockdown and the pandemic, actually, the government of India sent a letter to all the NGOs. The first line of the letter was that, thank you all for responding to the call of the government and come out in aid of the people in distress and responding to the situation. It was quite humorous. It was ridiculous to say the least, because nobody was responding to a government's call. There was no governmental assistance offered to any of the NGOs or the CSOs. On the other hand, people were actually put on check. People were being witch hunted, as I mentioned earlier. So then the exact aim of the initiative was to make sure that, okay, now you report to us what all you have done. Now, so that was in a lot of ways quite not surprising, because they've always been about claiming the work of CSOs. But at the same time, the government encroachment that you spoke about, and that continues about every space, because now this government sees this fantastic opportunity of people having bowed down to a lockdown which is induced by a pandemic. But on the other hand, also having to one by one submit to different kinds of lockdown-related authoritarianisms that come in. And the civil society is no different, because on the one hand, you're faced with a lot of surveillance. There's a lot of crackdown that had been happening on political dissent and civil society at large. So people have been very worried about this, and this encroachment has been taking a lot of space. But at the same time, I think, as I said earlier, this whole effort needs to be looked at also from the point of view of the political legitimacy battle that the conservative forces have been fighting. When they raised the whole thing as a communal issue of Muslims and Corona jihad, etc. in India, it was the civil society that fought that space of kind of complete encroachment by the state. So I think there is a lot that is wanted. There's a lot of space rebuilding that is required at this stage. There's a lot of challenge that is happening from this form of authoritarianism. This was completely unexpected in a lot of senses. People were prepared about climate crisis related things. People were not prepared for a virus pandemic that could force people for physical distancing. But at the same time, I think this rebuilding could also be reimagining the civil society at large. Because do we want an advocacy campaigning civil society that is urban based, or do we actually want to think of efforts that fundamentally challenge the nature of this democratic, majoritarian democracy and economic paradigms? I think that's a question that is really coming up well, and I think that civil society has a responsibility to uphold those questions.
Maureen, this question of democratic encroachment or political encroachment, Zimbabwe already not a very democratic place, but in some ways becoming even less so in the situation. What kind of things do you think, I know you're close to the work of the Zimbabwean, lawyers for human rights or other human rights organizations. What kind of things can be done now to try to resist this kind of new encroachment?
So I think that in the absence of being able to do political action such as, protests and other things because of restrictions that are legitimate, I think the other things that are happening, especially the heavy-handedness of police and the soldiers on the people, which is clearly bent on, demobilizing people, even like in the future, so that they're not, critical of the government. I think at this point, what we need to do is that there is need for more documentation. People need to know what is happening in each and every country, especially in countries like mine, where there's a lot of abuse from state agents. I think documentation and speaking out about these things online is very important. Last year in January, when people were killed on the streets here in Zimbabwe, the government actually cut internet for 72 hours. And in those 72 hours, a lot of horrendous things happened. And the reason why they cut that internet is because they understood what it would do if the world could, see those things. So documenting and citizen journalism, I think organizations that work with media, this is their time to also be getting into communities, through online platforms, teaching people how to just, record short videos when these things happen. Write about it, be anonymous if you want, but at least let the world know. And I think also the courts have become, another battlefront. People in civil society and citizens must just be able to use the courts, because in as much as you don't get the, the fair outcome, but at least there's a record that during this lockdown, these things happened and we can check them up in the near future. And I also think that in terms of regional and international bodies, like intergovernmental organizations, the United Nations, SADC, AU, they have to play a more central role. So our activism doesn't have to be only national now. We have to forge, international and regional alliances with other civil society organizations, petition the AU, petition SADC, petition the UN, and to make them to start to think of other ways, to enhance their monitoring, especially of authoritarian states like authoritarian governments like the Zimbabwean government. So I think those are some of the things that we need to start to look at.
I want to, sorry, Maureen, thanks. We have just 5 minutes, 4.5 minutes left, and I want to ask the group, each of you, 1 minute to step back and think of it's not exactly a philosophical question, but kind of a bigger perspective. We're in the thick of this. We're all right in the middle, both psychologically and practically, of an extraordinary time in contemporary history. If we look out, Alexandra Chmielewska asked a question, one of our viewers, in a sense, what of all of this is going to last? Let's put ourselves out a year or two, let's say 2 years, and we hope that, we've moved significantly beyond the pandemic at that point, yet there'll still be the lasting economic effects and many other things. What will have changed? We feel a sense of change now. But if you were to make a prediction, I've learned not to predict much because one's usually wrong, but that's okay. Let's give it a try. If you were to think, you go out 2 years and you look back and say, that really changed. that was a pivotal time, or no, you know, we went back to normal and that all kind of disappeared. So just as a little thinking exercise, about 45 seconds each, if I asked you to think, what do you think will have changed with respect to civic activism and civil society, not societies generally in life, but with respect to civic activism? Yusuf, put you on the spot, and I'm keeping my eye on the clock, so we're going to have to be really brief.
Well, I think the fact that now many civic society activists, who at least in the last 10 years, many of them got used to restricting themselves to their own circles, many of them now are moving back to the street and are reconnecting with the general public. So I think this is one very important thing that the COVID-19 situation created. Another, I think, another important point is what Maureen was just mentioning, where because everyone is online, at a regional level, we see more and more interconnection between civil society groups. For now, it's on webinars, but this is also something that may create a regional movement in the future.
Okay. Vijayan, India doesn't usually fit into 45 seconds. Too big and complicated. But what are one or two things you think, you know, that really changed?
Well, I hope the crisis doesn't last that long, but against hope, one also realizes that this is going to be a long haul here. I think winning over a situation, as Maureen said, of global solidarities and building local movements, but also at the same time local work amongst people could be the biggest challenge for civil society. And I think that's where I would like to see us 2 years from now, imagining that yes, COVID really brought back some thinking into our mind and forced us to rethink. And we are here in a new paradigm addressing things better.
Good. Janjira, what about you?
Well, I think in Asia, the impact of the COVID-19 could be very similar to the Asian economic crisis in 1997, where it constitutes a kind of external shock that changed the whole political system in the region. So, I mean, I learned not to predict, but I feel that after this, there would be a huge change when it comes to political regime if a lot of people are affected by the economic recession.
Okay. Maureen, 30 seconds. What do you think, just in Zimbabwe, civic activism, where might it have changed?
I think we'll see more of an organic civil society that is more connected to the people. I think we'll also we'll also see a hybrid civil society that works on socioeconomic issues, also on political and civil rights issues. Okay. I think we're also going to see a civil society that is more creative, more creative on online platforms, and that doesn't just plan physically.
Thank you. Okay, we're coming to an end. Viewers, thanks for joining us, and our hardworking panel. Thanks for digging in and dealing with all these really hard questions. This is just like the start of a conversation. There's so many important issues, but I think it's been a good start in thinking through some of them. Thank you all for joining. We look forward to seeing you again another time.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.